We grow up believing intelligence is something that can be measured, something that can be proven, something that can be compared. The question is, never, how do you think, but how smart are you? And somewhere along the way, many people quietly decide that they are not enough, not fast enough, not sharp enough, not logical enough, not impressive enough, and that belief settles deep. It shapes how they speak, how they hesitate, how they doubt themselves, even when no one else is watching. But intelligence was never meant to be reduced to speed or scores or rankings. Intelligence is not a trophy. It is a relationship between attention, awareness, and response. And long before modern psychology tried to compress it into numbers, humans were already observing. Something subtle, something undeniable, that different minds experience reality in profoundly different ways. Astrology did not emerge from ignorance. It emerged from observation. Before microscopes, before brain scans, before data sets, people watched how certain individuals moved through time, how some were drawn to action, while others were drawn to meaning, how some spoke through emotion, while others through structure, how some needed solitude to think, while others needed motion. Astrology was never asking who is superior. It was asking who is oriented where, and that distinction matters more than we realize. Modern culture rewards a specific cognitive style, one that is fast, verbal, analytical, decisive, one that can answer quickly, explain clearly, and perform under pressure. And when that style is treated as the definition of intelligence, everything else begins to feel like a flaw. Depth becomes slowness, sensitivity becomes weakness, intuition becomes unreliability, emotional awareness becomes distraction, and so people with quieter minds, with reflective minds, with symbolic minds begin to doubt themselves. They try to become sharper, louder, quicker than they naturally are, and in doing so, they lose touch with the intelligence they already possess. Astrology speaks to this loss, not as a belief system, but as a mirror. It reflects cognitive tendencies through symbols, because symbols bypass the part of the mind that needs to be convinced. They speak directly to recognition. You don't read a symbolic description and think this is scientifically valid. You feel this feels familiar, and familiarity is not proof, but it is information. And psychology tells us that self-understanding begins with awareness. You cannot change a pattern you cannot see. Astrology historically functioned as a way of seeing patterns. Before we had clinical language, it named tendencies, rhythms, inclinations, emotional styles, ways of responding to pressure and uncertainty. Not to trap people, but to give them language for difference. Think about how differently people respond to the same moment. One person immediately analyzes, another feels tension in their chest, another acts without thinking, another freezes, another withdraws into imagination, another starts searching for meaning. None of these responses are wrong. They are expressions of different internal priorities, but modern systems rarely honor that. They reward the response that looks most efficient, even if it is not the most appropriate. IQ tests measure something real, but limited. They measure how quickly and accurately you can process specific kinds of information under controlled conditions. They do not measure how well you sit with ambiguity, how deeply you feel, how intuitively you sense danger or opportunity, how wisely you choose when not to act, how meaningfully you connect with others, how gracefully you integrate emotion and logic over time. And yet these are the forms of intelligence that shape lives, relationships, art, leadership, and inner peace. Astrology does not measure intelligence. It describes orientation. Some minds face outward, constantly scanning the environment, seeking stimulation, novelty, movement. Others face inward processing, slowly, deeply looping through memory, imagination, and meaning. Some minds organize reality into systems. Some experience it through sensation, some through emotion, some through narrative. Astrology gives symbolic language to these orientations. Not to say this is who you must be, but this is how your attention naturally moves. The problem begins when astrology is used unconsciously, when people outsource responsibility to symbols, when patterns become excuses instead of insights. But that danger exists in every psychological framework. Personality tests, attachment styles, diagnoses. None of them are harmful until they are used to avoid growth. Astrology becomes harmful only when it replaces awareness instead of deepening it. Used consciously, astrology becomes reflective. It invites questions rather than answers. Why do I react this way under pressure? Why am I drawn to these experiences? Why do I struggle in environments others thrive in? Why do I repeat certain emotional patterns even when I want to change? These are not questions of fate. They are questions of attention. One of the most damaging myths about intelligence is that it should look the same in everyone. That there is a correct way to think, feel, and respond. And when people don't match that image, they internalize shame. But intelligence is contextual. A mind that thrives in chaos may struggle in routine. A mind that excels in solitude may falter in noise. A mind that feels deeply may take longer to decide, but may choose more wisely. Astrology quietly acknowledges this contextual nature. It suggests that intelligence has seasons, rhythms, cycles, moments of expansion and contraction. This is why intelligent people are often drawn to astrology. Not because they abandon critical thinking, but because they recognize pattern language. They understand that not everything meaningful can be quantified, that some truths are felt before they are proven, that symbols can hold complexity without flattening it. There is something deeply human about wanting to understand why you are the way you are, why certain environments drain you, why certain conversations energize you, why certain choices haunt you, while others feel aligned. Astrology offers a vocabulary for that exploration. It does not tell you what to do. It gives you a way to observe. In psychology, observation precedes integration. When you observe a pattern without judgment, it begins to loosen its grip. Astrology can serve that function. It externalizes inner tendencies so they can be seen rather than defended against. When you recognize yourself in a description, you stop fighting yourself. You begin to ask, how do I work with this? Instead of how do I fix this? Modern life leaves little room for this kind of reflection. Everything moves quickly. Decisions are rewarded for speed, not depth. Emotions are treated as obstacles. Attention is fragmented. And in that environment, many people feel unintelligent, not because they lack intelligence, but because their intelligence requires slowness, silence, or meaning to emerge. Astrology creates a pause. It invites contemplation. It asks you to look inward before moving outward. There is a quiet intelligence in knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, in knowing when to act and when to wait, in knowing which battles are yours and which are distractions. Astrology points toward this kind of wisdom, not through instruction but through awareness. When you strip astrology of superstition, what remains is psychological mapping, a way of noticing how different minds process reality, how they experience time, how they respond to uncertainty, how they seek security, meaning connection or freedom. And once you see these differences, you stop comparing. You start understanding. The most intelligent thing a person can do is learn how their own mind works, not how someone else's mind works, not how society expects them to think, but how they naturally orient themselves toward life. When you understand that, you stop wasting energy trying to become something you are not, and you start refining what you already are. Astrology does not replace psychology. It complements it. It speaks in metaphor where psychology speaks in data. Both are trying to understand the same thing, the human mind moving through a complex, unpredictable world. Perhaps the reason this conversation feels important now is because so many people feel disconnected from their own intelligence. They consume endlessly, they perform constantly, but they rarely listen to themselves. Astrology invites listening. It invites slowness. It invites curiosity without pressure. The question is no longer, is astrology real? The question becomes, what happens when you use it as a mirror rather than a map? What happens when you stop asking what will happen to me and start asking, how do I respond to what happens? What patterns shape my choices? What tendencies color my perception? What strengths do I underuse because they are quiet? And what weaknesses persist because I avoid looking at them? Intelligence is not loud. It does not always announce itself. It often whispers through intuition, through hesitation, through subtle discomfort, through moments of clarity that arrive when everything goes quiet. Astrology gives those whispers form. It gives them images, symbols, language. Here is Ipshir. Part 2. Continuing seamlessly in tone, feeling, and depth. Written to be unfailingly, emotionally immersive. Slow and reflective. It flows naturally from part 1 and can stand alone as the second half of a long video. When you begin to observe your mind instead of judging it, something subtle shifts. You stop trying to force clarity where patience is needed. You stop demanding certainty where exploration is required. You stop mistaking discomfort for failure, and in that space, intelligence begins to reveal itself, not as brilliance but as alignment. Many people live their entire lives trying to think faster, louder, sharper than they naturally are. They admire a type of intelligence that was never meant to be theirs, and in doing so, they abandon the quieter forms of knowing that once guided them. Astrology gently reminds us that minds move in different directions. Some expand outward, constantly searching for possibility, novelty, and experience. Others contract inward, seeking meaning, depth, and coherence. Neither is better. One gathers information. The other integrates it. One explores. The other refines. Intelligence needs both. But when a society rewards only expansion, depth begins to feel like stagnation. And when depth is misunderstood, those who carry it begin to doubt themselves. Psychologically, this creates fragmentation. When you suppress your natural cognitive rhythm, you lose trust in your own perception. You hesitate even when you are right. You seek permission for instincts that once came naturally. Astrology, at its most grounded form, restores that trust. Not by telling you what to do, but by reminding you how you tend to move. Think about decision-making. Some people decide quickly and adjust later. Others need time to feel their way into clarity. When the fast mind is praised, the slow mind begins to feel defective. But slowness is not lack, it is incubation. Many of the most profound insights emerge not through speed, but through waiting. Astrology symbolically honors this by recognizing cycles, phases, and timing. It suggests that intelligence is not constant output, but responsive movement. Modern life rarely respects timing. Everything is urgent, everything is immediate, everything demands reaction. Astrology introduces the idea that readiness matters, that forcing action before understanding creates fragmentation, that sometimes the most intelligent response is stillness, and stillness is something our culture struggles to value. Emotionally intelligent minds often suffer the most in performance-driven environments. They sense undercurrents, they feel unspoken tension. They notice what is about to shift before it does, but because this awareness is difficult to quantify, it is often dismissed. Astrology speaks directly to this kind of sensitivity, not as weakness, but as perception. It suggests that feeling is a form of knowing, not an obstacle to it. When you start to see intelligence this way, you stop trying to dominate life. You begin to listen to it. You pay attention to how different situations activate different parts of you. You notice where you become reactive and where you become clear. You stop labeling these responses as good or bad and start treating them as information. Astrology historically functioned as a language for this observation. It allowed people to externalize inner tendencies so they could be discussed, reflected on, and worked with. Without modern psychology, people still needed ways to understand themselves. Symbols filled that gap, not because they were mystical, but because they were memorable, meaningful, and emotionally resonant. One of the quiet dangers of reducing intelligence to metrics is that it creates hierarchy. It tells people where they stand rather than how they function. Astrology resists hierarchy. It does not place minds on a ladder. It places them in a circle. Each orientation necessary. Each perspective incomplete on its own. This circular view of intelligence is deeply psychological. Growth does not move in straight lines. It moves in cycles. People revisit the same lessons at deeper levels. Each time with more awareness, astrology mirrors this cyclical nature. It reminds us that development is not about escaping patterns, but about engaging them consciously. When people say, astrology limits you, what they often mean is unconscious astrology limits you. The same is true of any framework. Used unconsciously, labels become cages. Used consciously, they become mirrors. The difference is awareness. If you believe you are doomed to act a certain way, you surrender responsibility. If you recognize tendencies, you gain choice. Awareness creates space between impulse and action. And that space is where intelligence lives. Many people misunderstand self-knowledge as self-fixation, but understanding your patterns is not narcissism, it is accountability. When you know how you tend to react, you can pause before repeating harm. When you know your blind spots, you can seek balance. When you know your strengths, you can stop apologizing for them. Astrology encourages this kind of responsibility when used correctly. It asks you to study yourself, not excuse yourself, to observe how your mind responds under stress, not justify why it lashes out, to notice how you avoid discomfort, not blame fate for stagnation. There is also something deeply grounding about recognizing that you are not random, that your tendencies follow patterns, that your struggles have structure, that your gifts have shape. Astrology offers that reassurance, not by promising control, but by offering coherence. Psychologically, coherence is healing. When experiences make sense, they lose their power to overwhelm. When you can name what you are experiencing, you regain agency. Astrology provides naming without forcing certainty. This is why many people return to astrology during periods of confusion, transition, or burnout, not because they want answers, but because they want orientation. They want to understand where they are within themselves, and understanding location is often more important than knowing destination. Intelligence expressed through astrology is not about prediction. It is about presence. It is about recognizing where your energy goes when you are not forcing it. It is about noticing what drains you and what restores you. It is about understanding why certain environments sharpen you while others dull you. Once you understand this, you stop comparing your pace to others. You stop trying to keep up with minds that move differently. You begin to respect your own rhythm, and rhythm is intelligence expressed over time. Perhaps the deepest intelligence is not knowing everything, but knowing yourself well enough to navigate uncertainty with grace. Astrology, at its best, supports that navigation. It reminds you that you are not broken for being different, that your mind is not wrong for moving the way it does, that awareness grows not through speed, but through honesty. And as you continue this exploration, the question becomes less about belief and more about relationship. What is your relationship with your own mind? Do you listen to it or fight it? Do you trust its signals or override them? Do you give it space to process or demand immediate answers? Because in the end, intelligence is not something you prove to others. It is something you cultivate within yourself. And astrology, when approached with psychological maturity, becomes one of many quiet ways to begin that cultivation. Here is on part 3. Written to complete the emotional and psychological arc. Slow, grounded, and resonant, continuing seamlessly from part 2, without changing tone or depth. As awareness deepens, something unexpected happens. The need to define yourself begins to soften. You no longer cling to labels, even meaningful ones, because you start to feel the fluidity of your own mind. You notice that you are not one way all the time. You change with context, with fatigue, with safety, with curiosity. Intelligence reveals itself, not as a fixed identity, but as adaptability. And this is where astrology, if held lightly, begins to dissolve into wisdom. When people first encounter astrology, they often want certainty. They want to know who they are, what will happen, and what to expect. But psychological maturity moves in the opposite direction. It becomes comfortable with not knowing. It learns to sit inside questions without rushing to answers. Astrology mirrors this maturity when it is used as reflection rather than prediction. It becomes a way of noticing internal weather rather than forecasting external events. One of the quiet gifts of symbolic systems is that they allow you to speak about complexity without collapsing it. When you say you feel conflicted, it can feel vague. When you say, part of me wants stability and part of me wants freedom, something sharpens. Astrology has always been a language for naming inner multiplicity, not because the mind is divided, but because it is layered. Modern culture often pressures people to be consistent, to have a clear brand, a fixed personality, a stable identity, but the psyche resists this simplification. We evolve, we regress, we revisit old themes with new awareness. Astrology recognizes this cyclical return. It does not shame repetition. It assumes it. Developmentally, this is crucial. Growth is not linear, it is recursive. Each time a pattern reappears, you have the opportunity to respond differently, and responding differently is intelligence in action. Many people fear self-exploration because they think it will trap them, but the opposite is true. The more conscious you become of your tendencies, the less power they have over you. Astrology does not limit possibility. It reveals probability, and probability exists to be engaged, not obeyed. There is also a quiet humility embedded in astrological thinking. It suggests that you are part of larger rhythms, that your struggles are not entirely personal, that human beings across time have wrestled with the same fears, desires, and contradictions. This sense of belonging reduces isolation, and psychologically, isolation is one of the greatest threats to well-being. When you realize that your inner conflicts are shared archetypal experiences, you stop treating them as personal failures. You begin to see them as developmental invitations. This shift alone can transform how you relate to yourself. Instead of asking what is wrong with me, you begin asking what is trying to emerge through me. Intelligence at this level becomes less about problem-solving and more about meaning-making. It is the ability to contextualize experience rather than control it. Astrology supports this by framing life as movement rather than outcome. It reminds you that this moment is not the whole story, that confusion does not negate intelligence, that uncertainty is not ignorance, but transition in a world that demands answers. Astrology offers patience. It slows the mind enough to feel what is actually happening beneath reaction and narrative. And when you slow down, you notice how often your intelligence is drowned out by urgency, by expectation, by fear of falling behind. The most integrated minds are not the ones with the most information, but the ones who know how to pause. They know when thought has reached its limit and feeling must take over. They know when feeling has saturated and structure is needed. They know when to seek connection and when to return to solitude. Astrology symbolically points toward this balance, not by prescribing behavior, but by reminding you that imbalance is part of learning. At some point, the need to identify as a certain type fades. You stop saying, I am this kind of mind, and start saying, right now, this is how my mind is responding. This shift from identity to process is profound. It releases pressure. It restores curiosity. And curiosity is one of the highest expressions of intelligence. When you are curious, you are open. When you are open, you can adapt. When you can adapt, you grow. Astrology encourages this openness when it is not treated as destiny. It invites you to observe rather than conclude, to reflect rather than predict. Perhaps the quietest truth beneath all of this is that intelligence is relational. It emerges between you and your environment, between you and others, between you and yourself. It cannot be isolated into a score because it lives in movement, interaction, and awareness. Astrology as a symbolic system mirrors this relational quality. It speaks in patterns, not absolute cycles, not endpoints. And as you integrate these insights, something settles. You become less interested in proving intelligence and more interested in living it. You listen more, you react less, you choose with greater alignment. You forgive yourself for being human. At that point, astrology becomes almost unnecessary because its purpose has been fulfilled. It has guided attention inward, it has named patterns, it has softened judgment. And once awareness is established, the symbols can be released. What remains is a quieter, deeper intelligence. One that does not rush to define itself. One that trusts timing. One that understands that clarity arrives when the mind is allowed to breathe. And perhaps that is the real invitation. Not to believe, not to dismiss, but to observe. To sit with your own mind long enough to recognize its rhythm. To stop comparing your intelligence to others and start honoring how yours naturally unfolds. Because intelligence is not something you finish developing. It is a practice of listening, responding, and integrating again and again, and any tool that helps you do that, whether psychological, symbolic, or experiential, has served its purpose. If you have ever felt out of place, misunderstood, or underestimated, it does not mean you lack intelligence. It may mean your intelligence expresses itself differently. It may mean your mind moves in rhythms that modern systems do not reward. Astrology reminds us that difference is not deficiency, it is orientation. So instead of asking which sign is the smartest, ask yourself, how does my mind experience the world? Where does my attention naturally go? When do I feel most clear, most alive, most aligned? And when do I feel fragmented, drained, or lost? What patterns repeat in my relationships, not as fate, but as habit? And what would change if you approached those patterns with curiosity instead of judgment? Intelligence is not proven through performance. It is cultivated through awareness. Astrology, when approached psychologically, becomes one of many tools for that cultivation. Not because the stars decide your life, but because reflection deepens it. And perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath all of this. In a world obsessed with speed, certainty, and metrics, the most intelligent act may simply be to pause, to observe, and to understand yourself a little more deeply before moving forward.